Chapter 12, we're talking English colonization. So we're following this up right after the Spanish colonization. And so to think about that, timing is really important. It's in the early 1500s that the Spanish do all of their colonization and begin to colonize. It's not until 100 years later that English start to reach Jamestown in 1607. And because they had seen what the Spanish had done for 100 years, they try to adopt that exact same strategy. And it doesn't work. It becomes incredibly unsuccessful. And so when you think of this, is they tried this to subjugate the natives, to take them captured, but it wasn't possible. The natives in Virginia were not one single empire or one single tribe, but a combination of several different tribes. So you capture the leader of one tribe and you don't gain the allegiance of anyone else. Secondly, there's not a lot of gold and silver. So the extractive resources aren't very helpful. They're going to have to grow their own food. And so at this time in 1608, when Christopher Newport goes to England to return, John Smith of Pocahontas fame says, we need new types of people. Rather than send soldiers, send us carpenters, husbandmen, gardeners, fishermen, people to help us build our own communities here because we're not able to subjugate the natives and take advantage of what they have. King of England doesn't respond well to this. Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. So in a sense, Christopher Newport returns and they invite King Wahanasakak to the fort of the English and says, we will grant you king. His response, if your kings have sent me presents, I am also a king, and this is my land. Your father is to come to me, not I to him, nor yet to your fort, neither will I bite at such a bait. And so they are very unsuccessful in adopting the Spanish strategy throughout the colonies. So they change. They change their strategy. Rather than try to subjugate the natives, they're going to try to push them off their land, coerce them into trade, and then bring settlers into these colonies, these English settlers. And they're going to allow them to start forming some of their own laws while they're subject to the King of England. So if April showers bring May flowers, what do Mayflowers bring? Simple. Pilgrims. And so who are these people? Why do they come? Well, let's do a quick family history. This is a rough time for England. All right, so you have Henry VIII. He's Catholic, but he wants a divorce. Can't get a divorce if you're Catholic at this time period. He goes to the Pope and says, I need a divorce. Pope says no. So he's like, all right, I'm going to form my own church. He declares himself the supreme head of the church. And he establishes a Protestant religion, the Church of England, within his country. Edward VI takes over. He's very fiercely Protestant. He dies. He's only 9, not a big deal. So his sister takes over, Mary I. Mary was Catholic. So as she takes over, she realizes my father was in error. He should have got divorced. This church is wrong. She burns 300 Protestant clergy at the stake. She becomes known as Bloody Mary. So she then changes the country from Protestant to Catholic. But she only lasts 5 years. And her sister takes over, Elizabeth I, and she lasts a lot longer, but she's Protestant, the Virgin Queen. And so we see this time period of a lot of turmoil and a lot of war. This was not a bloodless time. This was very bloody battles. And that's what leads then into the exploration. But when Elizabeth dies, she has no kids. So we go all the way over this long line, and James I comes along. James I is the James of the King James Bible, but he becomes the King of Scotland, or he was the King of Scotland, and he's Protestant. So he moves away from Catholicism back to Protestant, and he establishes what he calls the 5 Articles of Perth, and it stipulates the governance of religion. The Pilgrims were like, we don't agree with those. So the Pilgrims take off. They head out to the Netherlands where they hang out, and they then seek a charter from the King of England to be able to go west and establish their own colony in the Americas. Now they had a location set aside, New York City. They're still part of the Northern Virginia colony. But because of a storm, they were pushed further north, which led to some really interesting outcomes. Landing in Plymouth, they were able to meet Somerset and Squanto, who had learned English from previous explorers. And they were able to establish some peaceful relations to be able to trade with the natives there to help them get through the first years. But they came over on the Virginia Compact contract. It was very clear what was expected of them. But because they landed so far north of this storm, many of them argued that they should not be subjugated to this contract. The contract was null and void. Others thought they should still do it. And so that's where they came up with the Mayflower Compact. It established self-governance in the colonies. That was very important for the colonists in that they maintained their allegiance to the king, but it also established self-governance in the colonies. The Mayflower Compacts oftentimes thought of as the first constitution in the Americas. As we see the foundation of other colonies in the north, the Puritans, William Penn and the Quakers in Pennsylvania, many of the northern colonies were founded by groups seeking religious freedoms. Another thing that's really interesting in the north is the ground wasn't as fertile. It's very cold in the northeast. And so therefore they had to turn to other industries and to innovation to try to survive. So rather than grow wheat and rye in the Northeast, they turned to corn, a little easier to grow in New York and those states. They turned to axes and other innovations to help them clear their forested land. They turned a lot to fishing as a commodity, as a life-sustaining resource for them, and used the dead fish as fertilizer for the ground. The South was different. The South, like Virginia, Jamestown, were people seeking economic opportunities. Furthermore, the economy of the South was based on agriculture. The soil there was incredibly fertile, easy to grow. You could have large plantations, large farms to grow tobacco, rice, indigo. But the problem is a lot of these were very labor intensive. And so the challenge came is how do we supply the labor? How do we bring workers to help on the farms in the South? So originally we turned to 4 different markets for labor. We turned to the headright system, which is any English citizen that came over was granted and given 5 or 50 acres of land. We're starting to see this transition of mercantilism into almost a free market system. Now, it's not free markets because Adam Smith hasn't been around to define that yet, but it's definitely going from an extractive institution to an inclusive institution. These individuals own the land. They don't have to give a certain percentage to the king. They may be taxed, but that's their land, that's their resources. They're going to benefit from that. And the headright system, though, it doesn't really solve the issue of labor. In fact, it exacerbates the issue. Because we have these colonists over, they have 50 acres. They can't do that all on their own. They need more people to come serve. So they turn to indentured servants, individuals who borrow their way to the new world, and they work 4 to 7 years. Another way to come over to solve labor is allow immigrants to borrow their money, but rather than pay off in time, they pay off in money. This gives them the risk. But the biggest factor we're going to see is the rise of slavery. That rather than just sell individuals' labors for a certain period of time or a certain amount of money, we're going to sell individuals themselves in perpetuity, meaning that it's not just them, but their children, their offspring. And most of these are coming from African nations. Now, why African nations? The book talks about different theories, but the biggest reason is in the southern part of the United States, malaria was a major issue. That's what killed a lot of even the European settlers. It killed a lot of the native population as well. So the native populations couldn't be used as slaves. But because of coming from West Africa, these individuals had built a tolerance and immunity to malaria. And that's one of the reasons is they were able to live longer as a result to immunity or to malaria. And that's why it became a comparative advantage to using slaves over indentured servants in the South. The North still used slaves, but the Southern, it was much more prevalent from the onset as a major part of their economy. So when we think of mercantilism in the colonies, one thing to note is part of this, the colonies were set up for a very mercantilist, extractive institution for the English. Now we start to see some of this movement towards inclusive institutions, but when we start seeing the navigation acts, the mercantilist acts, and these types of things, what we're seeing is notions of trying to grant charters and monopolies to specific companies so they benefit. And so mercantilism is still incredibly strong amongst the colonies. But we begin to see the formation of these inclusive institutions, and we begin to see the formation of even free markets. So who benefits from this navigation acts? They're having all the goods have to be shipped on English ships. It's the King of England who gets all that money, and it's the merchants who have those contracts. They're the ones that are going to benefit the most. And so we can juxtapose, and that's what the whole chapter is on why nations fail, juxtapose this English and the Spanish colonization. What was similar about them? What was different about them? Was one an extractive institution? Were they both extractive? What were elements of inclusive institutions within them? These are all really important questions that you can ask as you go through this chapter.